administration is considering requiring food manufacturers to put new labels on the front of packages. The additional labels would flag certain health risks like high levels of salt, sugar, or saturated fat, according to the Wall Street Journal. The FDA hopes that clearer labeling would lead Americans to healthier decisions as many battle diabetes and cardiovascular diseases.
And now in other news, women are being advised to get a mammogram every other year, starting at the age of 40. The U.S. Preventative Services Task Force had previously said that it would be safe for women to wait until 50 to begin having the scans. Those earlier recommendations caused major controversy as health advocates argue early detection gives patients the strongest chance of survival. Explaining their new recommendations, the task force chair, Dr. Wanda Nicholson, said, quote, more women in their 40s have been getting breast cancer, with rates increasing about 2% each year. So this recommendation will make a big difference for people across the country. Nicholson added that earlier tests could reduce deaths in breast cancer patients by up to nearly 20%. So it sounds to me that this news is related. We have all these health problems with our food, with FDA regulations not protecting the consumers as much as they should, and many carcinogens being present in products we purchase, including things we eat. And so it's very scary to be at this point in time when the solution policy-wise is not, okay, let's make some more regulations so the stuff that kills us and gives us cancer is not in our food. Instead, it's how about you get tested more regularly in a country where healthcare is something that people really struggle to afford.
Right, or the other recommendation is to make sure that you're putting more things on food labels. And exactly to your point, Jessica, why don't they just keep the harmful things out of the food in the first place so that you're not putting the burden on the consumer to determine whether or not what they're eating is safe. They're supposed to be able to trust that the FDA is only approving food, processed or otherwise, that is safe for human consumption. And so a lot of people are not going to read labels on a regular basis or obsessively to determine what kind of ingredients are actually in what they're eating. But unfortunately, that's the world that we've come to, where you can look at the back of pretty much any processed food that's in the grocery store, and it's filled with things like soy oil, sunflower oil, vegetable oil, and all of these other unpronounceable chemicals that are meant to keep foods shelf stable, but in some cases we don't know what the long-term ramifications of eating those things are. And I also always think about the fact that when we were kids, Jess, I'm sure you saw this in your school too, we were always taught about the food pyramid. And they've changed the food pyramid so many times throughout modern American history. But when I was growing up and when we were growing up, the food pyramid always talked about the fact that your main source of energy should come from bread and pasta and all of these carb and starch heavy foods, and things like protein and healthy fats were at the top of the food pyramid in this little triangle, meaning you shouldn't have too many servings of those. And in recent years, we've come to find out that really the opposite is true, that people should be eating high protein, high fat diets and limiting carb and sugar intakes, because those are much healthier forms of fuel for the body, whereas carbs get burned through very quickly, end up leaving you feeling hungrier, messing up your metabolism. And so we were all sort of brainwashed into this false way of thinking about food, and it led us towards these more processed diets as opposed to eating whole fruits, vegetables, and proteins. And on one of the consequences of that, I think, obviously we don't have any evidence to draw a direct connection, but there is a correlation here that more and more young people are being diagnosed with gynecological cancers in particular, whether breast cancer, ovarian cancer, prostate cancer. Every year, those percentages of people who are diagnosed with those types of cancers at young ages are ticking up and up. And it's very disturbing to think that because we were supposedly doing the right things, the things that the government advised us to do when we were young, or that our parents did, what they advised our parents to do in terms of feeding their children when we were young, we're now growing up and we're sicker and sicker than ever.
Right. You also have the influence of big money, not just in the big industries and even the alphabet soup of government agencies. I mean, the USDA has a ton of money invested in the manufacturing of America's biggest food companies and corporations. But it's also a big factor that there's funding directly from people who have a vested interest in the result of the study going in one direction. That's the direct funding for the research that's relied on to create guidelines like the food pyramid. And you have the USDA and Health and Human Services working together to create the guidelines. And so when you ask doctors, Dr. Willett, who is a doctor that works with the Department of Nutrition at the Harvard School of Public Health, he said the current system opens the guidelines up to lobbying and manipulation of data. And so that's really where we are, is the food pyramid is designed in a way to tell people that they should purchase food and eat the most food coming from the companies and the manufacturers that have a vested interest in you eating it, the food that they can profit the most off of and create the most off of with a smaller bottom line. It's much more expensive to grow a variety of vegetables and to grow them in a healthy way, an organic way, without a lot of pesticides, without a lot of antibiotics given, in the case of if it's livestock, given to the animals. That's more expensive than growing grain in mass and growing it in an unhealthy way, where instead of ensuring that the soil is very healthy, you're growing similar crops year over year, depleting the soil of a lot of the key chemical components that ensure the plant is healthy and producing an ultimate crop that's harvested that people can eat and get the most nutrients out of. We've seen a decline in the quality of the food we grow in the United States as well, but the way we're mass producing and mass producing foods that are not the ones that give us the most energy and the most nutrients and keep us healthy, it's the direct result of just greed, people wanting to make money off of what should be seen as something that's so essential, not just to a happy life, but also a good economy, to have workers that have energy to do quality work all day.
Yeah, I think it's true that a lot of these corporations definitely help fund these public health bureaucracies that make the regulations about their industry. But I think another element that isn't talked about as much is the fact that the public health bureaucracy often places a lot of stock in the so-called experts to make regulations about industries that frankly they know nothing about. I just met with a Maine lobsterman yesterday who was talking about some of the new fishing regulations that have been put on by the EPA that use studies that drastically undercount the lobster population in Maine because they basically don't go far enough offshore to drag their nets. They go in areas where basically the lobster are known not to be, and then make regulations based on that. And it could potentially destroy the fishing industry, particularly for Maine lobster. And we kind of see the same thing with agriculture, where you see people who don't farm for a living making policies that affect everyday farmers. I mean, your example about how farmers are incentivized, right? A lot of them receive subsidies to grow grain and wheat and some of these cash crops. But then they're told in the off season that they're supposed to not actually plant on some of their farmland. This is done through some of the regulations about rotating where they plant basically over the year. But if farmers had the choice, a lot of them would choose to plant a winter-based crop that actually re-enriches the soil during the off season so that they can continue to make money, but also so that their soil is ready for the spring planting season. And instead, they're actually paid sometimes by the government to not plant during the winter because the government believes that there's basically no way for them to keep the soil rich without not planting on it. And obviously farmers have been doing this for centuries. They know the soil and their land better than government bureaucrats. And I think it's unfortunate that we have outsourced so much of our policy making to people in these government agencies, many of whom really lack real world experience with what they're talking about. And we don't put things really through Congress anymore.
Yeah, I have friends who've worked in the USDA in the Midwest specifically. And I know that there are incentives for cover crops, like putting clover over your crops to protect the soil, so that throughout the winter you don't have this issue of the nutrients, in the soil being depleted. I haven't heard this happening in the other direction, where the government is incentivizing farmers not to use cover crops or winter crops. That's really interesting.
And there's fundamentally some very contradictory policies as it relates to ag in the U.S.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense when you have so many people in this revolving door between America's largest agricultural companies and then being on the board of the FDA and USDA. We definitely get contradictory policies a lot. The last time we got really deep into this topic, Amber, I was reflecting on how when you have someone who's living in a big city, usually on the coast, and they're eating healthy and organic and milling their own flour, trying to eat close to the source and avoiding some of these harmful, chemicals that are in foods, hormones, what have you, it's stigmatized in the direction of, oh, it's woo-woo stuff, it's, granola mom, it's cast away as this kind of like elitist, you're putting in too much effort thing. But then when it's happening in rural areas, it's cast away as, a trad wife thing. Why are you going back? Why are you being like a 1950s housewife? And it's so strange that no matter where you are, it gets stigmatized. I really think that we need to always criticize any kind of dominant narrative that goes in the direction of people people being disincentivized from being a consumer from America's biggest corporations. If you're telling people, oh gosh, it's so weird if you eat healthy food for whatever reason, that's something that really challenges the flow of capital in the United States. And whenever I hear something like that, I'm like, where's this coming from? Is this like really people who feel like this? Or is this some kind of propaganda that was intentionally disseminated in the United States because the largest corporations felt threatened by this trend, by this movement? And so when I think about where we are at with food in the US, we're definitely coming to a head. And I think when things seem most broken in US politics, it's really a signal that people are paying attention to something they haven't before. And they're like, oh no, why are we so divided about what our eating habits should be? When in reality, it's not brokenness, it's not division, it's really the public, the consumer, the masses waking up to how, their lives quite literally have been forsaken by the flow of capital and profit.
Yeah, I wonder if there is an element of astroturfing to some of those narratives. I know there definitely has been politicization across the aisle that you were, getting at with the criticisms of how people both in coastal, generally more liberal areas and then rural, perhaps more conservative areas live their lives. And maybe that's an element of how divisive our politics has become, such that everything, even the choices in food that we eat, has become political as well. But I know we're going to continue to cover these very important health stories for our viewers, and we will be back with more Rising after this.